Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carolyn Remick. I'm the Development Director here at CITRIS, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the CITRIS Research Exchange today. Over the past 10 years, we've hosted a remarkable lineup of technology innovators on this stage, and are glad to see all of you here today for the Fall 2019 series. Today's talk is co-hosted with our CITRIS Sustainable Infrastructures Initiative, which focuses on information technology research in energy, water, and transportation as parts of the cyber infrastructure of a sustainable society. The program builds on a network of labs, facilities, and experts across the 4 CITRIS campuses. Our speaker today is Jiang Lin, Nat Simons Professor, Presidential Chair in China Energy Policy, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, and Adjunct Professor here at UC Berkeley. In this talk, Sunsetting Coal Power in China, Professor Lin will discuss new visioning analysis on one potential pathway to decarbonize the power sector in China. We ask that you please do not interrupt during the talk to ask questions. There'll be dedicated time for Q&A at the end. So, our speaker today. At the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, Jiang Lin holds the Nat Simons Presidential Chair in China Energy Policy and serves as a staff scientist for the China Energy Group. At UC Berkeley, Lin is an adjunct professor at the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. Lin's research focuses on energy and climate policy, energy emissions pathways, electrical market and planning, low-carbon economic transition, and appliance efficiency issues in China. He co-directs the Berkeley Tsinghua Joint Research Center on Energy and Climate Change, a collaborative initiative between the Berkeley Lab, UC Berkeley, and Tsinghua University in China. Lin directed the Energy Foundation China Sustainable Energy Program from 2007 to 2013 and was its Senior Vice President for Strategy and Analysis from 2014 to 16, managing the growth of the Energy Foundation China into one of the largest international NGOs devoted to promoting clean energy and climate solutions in China. Before joining the Energy Foundation, Lin was at LBNL conducting research in the appliance standards and China Energy Groups from 1994 to 2007. Lin has a PhD in demography from UC Berkeley, an MS in population studies, and a BS from the Department of Cybernetics Engineering in Xi'an Jiaotong University in China. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Caroline, for that warm introduction. Thank you for all coming, braving the hot weather today on campus and probably across the country. But we're talking about potentially a hot topic under the current environment, and I hope you're all comfortable in your seat. How many of you are aware what is happening in New York this week at the UN? Okay, how many of you have heard of Greta Thunberg? Okay, good. I mean, a good audience. I'm not talking in the dark. As Caroline mentioned, today I want to share a new analysis, we call it a visioning exercise, about what we can do in terms of phasing out coal power plants in China. This is a collective exercise. We have several collaborators. I think Xu Liu is in the audience here, but also working with Dr. Carl for Energy Environmental Economics in San Francisco, and Professor Hu from North China Electric Power University. As you might recall, last year, the International Panel on Climate Change issued a special report which essentially stated that global net emission need to reach 0 by mid-century. Right? 0. And today, roughly, we have energy-related carbon emission neighborhood of 40 billion tons. So, from that to 0, that's our challenge ahead of us. In order for the world to be on a pathway that's consistent with a 1.5 degree warming future, right, above the pre-industrial level. So today, power generation is the largest source of CO2 emission in the world, roughly 42%. In Asia, this number is even higher. This is the generation mix in China. Can you tell up to now, China generates 2/3 of electricity from coal combustion. The top line, the red line, going to the future, are the projection by the state grid in terms of future electricity demand growth. You know, great companies like to sell electrons, so they're probably on the higher end in terms demand forecast for China in the future. The next line, the orange line, is from International Energy Agency. This is one of the mainline agencies in the world, providing a lot of numbers, a lot of scenarios in terms of energy trend around the world, and they forecast roughly another 50% growth in electric demand in China. So that's the future we're looking to. Demand is growing, but what really needs to happen is for all the fossil generation to come down to zero. Right? That's the essential challenge. Can we do it in a timely fashion? Is that mission possible? So that's what our research team set out to do, to have this essentially what-if exercise to figure out, can cogeneration be substantially reduced or completely replaced by 2040? Right? Remember, the world needs to get down to zero in terms of emission by 2050, and power sector has to go first because other sectors, depending on clean electricity, to provide the reduction potential. So specifically, we're asking, under what conditions can this coal phase-out be possible while still meeting the growing demand reliably and without a significant economic loss in phasing out existing power plants? The second question, in addition to technology, keep the lights on, what are the institutional changes that need to happen to support such a transition to a zero carbon power system in the future? So why we're talking about power system in China? Right? Today, it roughly emits 13 to 15% global energy-related CO2 emissions. So a fast decarbonization in China's power sector is probably the single most important drivers to tackle global climate change. As I mentioned before, a zero-emission power system is also essential to decarbonize China's industry, building, and transport through electrification. Without clean power, electric vehicles are essentially emission elsewhere vehicles, right? So getting a clean power is foundational to have transportation sector to go clean as well. In addition to all the environmental global climate change concerns, a clean power system also fits with China's stated development goals, such as ecological civilization and the vision of beautiful China that's proposed by President Xi Jinping of China in the last few years. Despite the need to go to zero in a reasonable time frame, the future of China's coal power plant is highly uncertain. Right? Today, you still hear people who want to build coal plants, even among major agencies that conduct projections for gas of China's future. There's still a huge amount of coal in their scenarios. Here, I only use 3 agencies: International Energy Agency, the State Grid of China, which is the dominant grid operator with roughly 1 billion customers, and also CITRIS, which is a part of the Energy Resource Institute under NDRC, the main government think tank in energy scenario planning. So you can see in all the three major agencies planning, forecasting the future, they all have huge number of coal plant left in the scenario. Even among IEA scenarios, you have a 600 gigawatts of coal plant still left, roughly around 2040. This is simply incompatible if we want to get down to a 1.5 degree warming future. So something has to change. So our team essentially created 4 stylized scenarios to look at this problem. Essentially, both high demand, high renewable scenarios, and high demand, low renewable scenarios, and low demand, high renewable, and low demand, low renewable scenarios. The demand scenario I mentioned earlier, the high demand scenarios are really based on the state grids. Electrification scenario, implying more than doubling of electricity demand for China by 2040. For the low demand scenarios, we're essentially using IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario, which still implies more than 50% increase in electric demand by 2040. So regardless which scenario we believe, there's a huge amount of growth that's coming in China's electricity system. And that's one important point to remember. In contrast to the US system or some Western European power system, we have, in US, the demand growth is pretty flat, which is both a good thing and also pose challenges for a system in need of transition. Let me talk about how we design the 2 renewable scenarios, right? For the high renewable scenario, we're essentially, this is an iterative process. We want to increase wind, solar energy storage to essentially allow coal capacity to be completely retired by 2040. Right? So this is a user-driven definition. Even for the low renewable scenarios, we are still requiring increasing solar wind storage to essentially not allow any coal capacity to grow, but slowly decline over time. In both scenarios, there's a same amount of a conventional hydro, natural gas, nuclear capacity. Here, we did not really seriously consider carbon capture sequestration because it's really unclear how scalable, economically scalable that technology is, and we really don't have time to wait. We need to do something now with available technologies. So let me go to the result to share a few highlights. So the primary outcome in this exercise, in our low demand and high renewable scenarios, we can see coal capacity to be completely reduced to 0. No coal plant in 2040 under this scenario. We're still meeting that over 50% demand growth with a combination of essentially solar wind storage plus some of the hydro and gas capacities. Right? In the 3 other scenarios, if you look at the light blue, which is the high demand and high renewable scenarios, there's still a fair amount of coal capacity left, roughly 340 gigawatts of that, and give you a sense of scale. California's system capacity is roughly 50 gigawatts. So there's still a lot of coal left, but much lower than before, but mostly for reliability purposes. They're not run a lot, but they're used to make sure when you have a long duration when renewable are not sufficient to support the demand, there's capacity of coal to meet that as well. But notice that that's much lower than what China has today, roughly 1,100 gigawatts of coal capacity, which is the largest in the world. Next, we'll look at the sort of a generation mix going to the future. Here's what generation mix will transition under the low demand, high renewable scenarios. The black area on the bottom are the coal generation, and the blue are hydro, nuclear. So you can see coal comes down very quickly, or essentially reach about zero around 2035. There's a minor growth of hydro, a little bit more of nuclear, but what really stands out are the tremendous growth in terms of solar and wind generation in the fuel mix. Right? So by roughly 2035 or 2040, well, 2035, you're out of coal and there's still a little bit of gas left. By 2040, you're essentially a running system using all non-fossil energy form. As we shared earlier, the share of coal generation goes down to zero, pretty straight down to 2035. Even among other scenarios, the share of coal generation actually goes down very significantly. Even for the high demand, high renewable, the blue, the light blue line, you can see that also goes down to zero by 2040. Even for the least optimistic scenarios, which have a high demand but low renewable, the share of a coal generation is under 15% compared to 65, 66% today. So the system could potentially be transitioned massively in the next 20 years. So that all sounds good, easy. Here's the part that's a little bit required kind of a change your mindset, right? To make that happen, you have to significantly scale up solar, wind, and battery storage in the next 5 years, right? On the order of 50 to 70 gigawatts of solar and 64 to 84 gigawatts of wind. So give you the scale and contrast. In the last 2 years, China has built roughly 40 to 50 gigawatts of solar. So the incremental in solar is actually imaginable, right, for the next 5 years. But for wind, this implies probably a doubling, a tripling of existing installation speed for wind turbines. So that's a huge challenge. For storage, particularly the battery storage, it's an even higher growth requirement. So it's not a small asking in terms to complete transition China's power system to one without coal will require significant new actions to build a lot more solar, wind, and storage to support the system transition. One interesting insight is, regardless which scenarios, China needs to build a lot of new plants anyway because demand is growing. So there's a lot of new growth potential. The question is, you can choose to build with existing technology, you can choose to build with new technology. So the growth actually is a real opportunity to build clean instead of building dirty systems. And without growth, the challenge is even more significant. Now, you probably wonder, is this economic, right? Wind, solar, storage all sounds good. How does it compare with the existing technology in terms of cost, right? Yeah, so we purposely did not do a cost optimization model in this analysis because the cost trend is highly uncertain. All the major agencies in the world has forecast the cost of solar, wind, and storage. We're all behind the development trend, right? So technology innovation has always been faster. The costs come down a lot lower. So instead, we calculate what is so-called a break-even cost for solar and wind in China to beat coal generation, essentially. So you see on your right The yellow line are the cost of solar break-even point, and green lines are for wind. On your left, the 3 bars are showing the current cost of solar and wind in China. So you can see at the lower end of solar today, they are near that break-even point. For the lower part, the wind is actually already below that break-even point. So the point of a cost parity in terms of grid connected wind and solar is very close in China, and will likely to go down further. Just give you some pointers how low it can go, right? So the 4 dots below the line are showing some of the current cost estimates in the US. This is actually real cost, not an estimate. So the lowest cost solar in US today, roughly 2 cents per kilowatt hour. That's recently gotten in LA, in Southern California. And lower cost wind is down to less than 3 cents US, right? So this is today's cost, not the future. So there's still huge amount of potential for cost reduction in the future. So that really shows us that economically, as long as we keep on our track of installing more solar, the cost is going to come down in China as well to make this a cost competitive story, in addition to environmentally sound story. If we do all that, obviously the emission from the power system, which as mentioned before, is roughly 13 to 15% global CO2 related emissions, will come down to close to 0 by 2040 for the low demand and high renewable scenarios. Right? So that's essentially an outcome of our scenarios. So under such a scenarios, what does the future system look like? Right? The story essentially is we're building a lot more solar storage and wind to meet the summer peak demand. Okay. As a consequence, and this is a hourly dispatch for a typical day in the summer in 2040. You can tell on the bottom, the orange line are the nuclear, and the blue are hydro, and really in the middle, a lot more solar in the middle of the day generation. The right line are essentially the load. So in the middle of the day, you're all producing, but you're using storage system to charge. In the evening hours, you discharge to meet the evening peak as well. But also, the light, kind of a pinkish shade area, or what do we call it, economic curtailment. Because you cannot possibly economically store all the wind and solar you generate. Sometimes it's actually better economically to let it go. So when you overbuild for the peak, when you're not in the peak season, you don't need it so much, right? And which is even more interesting phenomena in the springtime when your load is much lower. So you have this huge, at the end of the day, curtailment issue, which could be, depending on your perspective, could be a problem. It could be also a giant opportunity, right? When you have essentially a lot of curtailment, which means zero cost electricity that's available in the spring days, you can do something with that, right? And you can probably using that to, one possibility you think about producing hydrogen for transportation fuels. When you have a lot of availability of essentially zero emission power at very competitive cost, near zero. So that provides an interesting opportunity to actually capture this potential. But in terms of operating the power system, this is one people have to get used to. Where we're not running everything all the time, and we're going to actually overbuild. So at a certain time, we'll have a lot of spare capacity. This also impact how you would actually build and finance the technology we need to be in place, which I'll talk about later. So come back to the conclusion part. Right? So based on this analysis, we find that reducing and ultimately retiring cogeneration is both technically and economically feasible. Right? That by using a combination of solar wind storage, you can actually meet the growing demand with the reliability as well, but does require a huge scaling up in solar wind generation and battery storage deployment. This is not a small challenge. But ultimately, that depending on variety of economic and institutional factors, right? Costs have to come down continuously to make solar wind competitive against cogeneration, particularly from existing coal power plant. Many have already been paid off in terms of their loans, and so they could actually produce very cheaply. But also this means no new unbided coal plant being built starting in 2020, as well as retiring all the existing coal plants at latest by their original depreciation schedule, which is typically 20 years. This will also require a significant change in how systems are operated, essentially using, you have to get used to the idea that oftentimes it is actually economic and beneficial, environment beneficial to curtail solar wind generation as you are, or essentially we're building the system for environmental performance. This also, as I mentioned before, require a totally different way of planning for the system. How do you buy it? How do you finance it? And how people pay for all the required investment, which is enormous in itself. In terms of the institutional or policy drivers, you might remember the two demand scenarios, right? So the difference are essentially 2 terawatt hours, and those are huge differences, right? So the effort to improve efficiency, to restrain the growth in demand, are actually probably the most important policy drivers in the future to moderate the growth in demand. The second, you have to start stopping permitting new coal-fired plants in China. Any new build essentially adds to the problem you have to deal with, both for environmental reasons and financial reasons, because if you build today and they're not economical 5 years, you have to deal with the asset question in itself. The third, transition to a system that dominated by variable generation, solar, wind, really require a very functioning wholesale market in China today. Because even wind and solar generation is still roughly 8% the generation mix in China, a huge amount of wind and solar energy are actually curtailed, are wasted, not being used. Now, a lot has to do with local protectionism. Yeah. So each locality or province want to buy their own local generation instead of importing or buying cheaper, cleaner wind and solar from other provinces. And a regional market, a wholesale market, would easily solve some of those institutional challenges. You have to start thinking more about reliability. It's just planning for base load generation, one coal plant at a time, 1 gigawatt at a time. You think about what do you need to ensure the system will still are reliable, and then what are the reliability requirements you want to put into it when you have such a high degree of variable generation technology on the system. The third, actually, you need to also, essentially aligning the planning of the power system with land use planning, because in the future we're envisioning here, you're going to have several thousand gigawatts of solar and wind built across country. The land is becoming an interesting issue to deal with. And there's plenty of land left, but there are also many other competing demand for usable land. So this is an issue that needs to be resolved as well. So one that probably you're thinking about, gosh, with all the plant that's being built already in China today, roughly over 1,100 gigawatts coal plant, how can you deal with the potential economic loss, all that, right? So one of the key insight in this is that if you stop making the new ones and retire them according to this historical depreciation schedule, we don't foresee a huge amount of stranded assets being lost in this regard as well. So the two conditions has to meet as well. I think I'll stop here to see anybody had any questions. Thank you for all coming.